What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we're going over the top waiver wire targets for week 14. We obviously know who all of the high upside players are at this point, and it's pretty unlikely there are any actual gems on free agency, but we will look at some options that you have, especially in some deeper formats, and then definitely look at some streaming options for quarterbacks and streaming options for defense if we're looking ahead into the fantasy playoffs. So I'll mention a few options, at tight end, wide receiver, some handcuffs you should have at running back. But at this point, you got to realize it's pretty unlikely there are any gems. So we'll get into all that in a second. But first, of course, have to start things off as usual this side of the day. The last stat we did was who currently leads the league in percent of team air yards. The answer was Terry McLaurin and still is after week 13. At Vike Rain was first to get that right on Twitter, and Daniel Herbert was first to get that right on YouTube. Today's stat: 2 running backs have lost at least 3 fumbles this season. Antonio Gibson is one. Who is the other one? Okay, so the top quarterback ads that I'm seeing this week, and again, only streaming. This would only be for this week. These aren't guys that I expect to be options for us week in and week out moving forward. Ryan Tannehill versus the Jaguars. He's 61% owned, but definitely possible that he was dropped in your league because they went on bye last week. So him also coming off bye will be nice. Cam Newton, 35% owned versus the Falcons. If he's announced a starter, if he's not starting, well, don't play him obviously, but I think he's going to end up starting. And Tyler Heineke versus the Cowboys. Tannehill will likely have the highest projection of this grouping, but remember that A.J. Brown is still going to be out, so he's not going to be in this game, though it is possible that Julio's back. Julio is eligible to return this week. We'll, of course, just see this week if he's able to return. The Jaguars have just a trash defense throughout, and their offense can't stay on the field, so that's a really good combination, right? Even if the Titans aren't able to move the ball on every drive, they're probably going to have a lot of drives because the Jaguars aren't going to be able to sustain long drives, and they're just not going to be able to stay on the field in general. So that's just a positive for the Titans. And then when that goes up also against a really, really bad defense, it's a great combination. Again, just want to point out, A.J. Brown not going to be there, so it's not the highest ceiling play in the world, but they don't have fantastic running backs also. So if Julio's back, they should be able to air it out a little bit, and I think he'll be a good option. After that, I think Cam is your next best option. As long as you understand the risk, right? He can start this game, but he started, 2 weeks ago, and he was awful. I mean, he was so bad against the Dolphins. Obviously, the Dolphins are a better defense than the Falcons. The Falcons don't have a strong defense. We saw what Tom Brady was able to do against them last week. Obviously, Cam Newton is not Tom Brady, but I think the point remains that they're a really, really big downgrade from the Dolphins coming off the bye. He's had one more week to come prepare with the team. It's worth noting also, though, that play calling might be different this next week. We had Joe Brady fired this last week, basically for not running the ball enough, which is kind of wild. The team had a 5-7 record. McCaffrey was hurt most of the season. Their backup running backs weren't all that good, so it's how do you blame him for not running the ball? But regardless, they're going to have different play calling, and so that is another risk you can add on top of Cam Newton. But despite these risks, he could run for 40 yards and 2 touchdowns, and then it literally doesn't matter what he did in the passing game. So I think he's the second best streaming option. And then finally, Heineke hasn't shown that much of a ceiling, but he hasn't cratered your lineup either, right? He's not going out there some weeks and getting 7 or 8 points. He's doing at least decent on average. He's probably, again, not going to post 25 fantasy points, especially because Dallas has a solid defense, but he's a good bet for 13 to 17. And so if that's kind of what you're looking for, you look at the rest of the options on free agency and you're like, this is gross. You can get modest production from Heineke, hopefully something on the ground. So while I prefer Tannehill, I prefer Cam Newton, Heineke is not a bad third option. I really don't see any other great streaming options this week. At tight end, almost not worth going over. Everyone knows who the lead options are. With everyone else, you're just praying for a touchdown. And since those are fairly random, you're really just guessing, trying to get guys with decent volume. I think that the top option is Conklin, 34% owned. He's not a bad pickup just because Thielen could miss some time. Now, if Thielen is going to return this week, he goes right back to what he was before, which is just a 2. He's a tight end 2. Not really someone you should be relying on as your 1 in an 8, 10, or 12 team league. He can be your 1 in a 14 or a 16 team league. It's kind of where he'd be ranked. But if Thielen were to miss some time, Conklin's going to see an increase in target share, increased role in the red zone, and he is still a decent weapon for them. So he'd be a pretty good add. Probably someone without Thielen that would be like a low-end one, somewhere in that like 10 to 13 kind of range. That's where I'd be guessing. Ricky Seals-Jones is also an option. I'm expecting him to return this week. He almost returned last week, but I think this week he's going to be back. Should be in for like close to 100% of the snaps. That's what we saw him at. He was a featured, not a feature weapon in the receiving game, but he was a weapon in the receiving game that they had run plenty of routes, right? Because that's all he does, right? He's not a fantastic blocker. RSJ is a receiving tight end. And when we saw Logan Thomas go down earlier in the year, they basically just had RSJ play the Logan Thomas role. Well, now RSJ is coming back. Logan Thomas will be done for the season now. So he's not a bad option. 6% owned. You should probably see him on free agency in pretty much every one of your leagues. And so if you need an option, that is not a bad one there. And then in deeper leagues, you can look at Evan Ingram. He's seen 5, 6, and 5 targets over the last 3 weeks, and he'll face the Chargers defense this next week, who kind of funnel targets to the middle of the field because of how good they are defending outside wide receivers. I wouldn't feel great about starting Evan Ingram, but again, he's an option in deeper leagues. Behind these guys, let's be honest, like you probably should have acquired, if you're looking at the fantasy playoffs, you should have acquired, a top 10 option at this point. Like, there have been plenty of opportunities to snag one of the top end guys when they've been underperforming, or to grab, free agents that are now ranked inside the top 10 rest of season that were on free agency. If you haven't done either of those, then I guess these guys are your options, but I would probably prefer to have gotten a top 10 option at this point. At wide receiver, you do have a few options. None of them are going to make like a real difference, though. Russell Gage, I think, is number one, 22% owned. Amon-Ra St. Brown is an option, 7% owned. Devonta Parker, if he's available, 55% owned. And Laquan Treadwell, 1% owned. Gage, again, top option this week. He has target counts of 8, 7, and 12 over the last 3 weeks, and he's turned that into over 17 PPR points per game. They have a brutal matchup at the Panthers this next week, and I would definitely not be playing him in that matchup, but if he's going to keep getting like 8 to 10 targets a week, then he should be owned in way more than 22% of leagues, right? So I think that this week, like, it's probably not someone you're picking up being like, oh, I need an option this week. That's not Gage. But if you're looking more long-term, someone that if you suffer injuries, if you're in a 14, 16 team league and you want someone that like can play that flex spot, that wide receiver 2, that second flex spot, and you don't really have a reliable option at this point, you don't need him for this week, maybe in the future, that's what I think Gage kind of is. If you're in a 10-team league, literally, if you're in a 10-team league, you're probably not even looking at any of these options because it's just not worth it. Try to find someone that's like owned in 80% of leagues that just happens to be unowned in your league that I'm just not going to go over in this video because I can't go over everyone that's 80% owned. I think in 8, 10-team leagues, you're probably not looking at this list. You start looking at Gage on like a 12-team league because, again, if he's getting 8 to 10 targets, he could just be owned everywhere. But beyond that, I think most of these plays are 12, 14, 16-team leagues. So next one, Amon-Ra St. Brown. It's hard to say I like a Lions wide receiver because it's the Lions. They have no real talent. Like, I'm talking about St. Brown. I don't think he's like that fantastic. I don't love him as a prospect. But if you want to think about, to close the season, who are they going to try and develop, right? Who do they want out there getting targets? It's obviously St. Brown ahead of their other wide receivers. He was their 4th-round rookie this season. And again, while I didn't love his profile, and I don't think long-term he's going to be a reliable fantasy asset, I think that they're going to give him opportunities to close the season. I think he'll be out there. They're going to be trailing in pretty much every game. And so if he's going to get 5 to 7 or maybe 8 targets per game to close the season, well, that's valuable, right? Not in 8 or 10 team leagues because he's like, a more low ADOT player. Again, someone that, he's not like some breakout rookie wide receiver, right? So his 6 targets is way different than like a more established wide receiver that maybe works a little more down the field. But again, more competitive 12-team leagues, 14, 16-team leagues, I think you can start looking at him. Also, Parker, I mentioned he's owned in more leagues, but with him, just coming back healthy, it's possible that in your league he's not owned. He struggled through injuries this season, but his target counts, looking back, 7, 9, 7, 9, 11, and 5. And he's averaged 65 receiving yards per game. So he's been like pretty decent this season when he's played. Now he's on bye this week, and so again, you can't use him this week, obviously. So if you're looking for someone to pick up, it's not Gage, it's not Parker. But moving forward, as we're going to talk about actually with the Dolphins defense, they play the Jets. So they play the Jets after they go on bye. That could be a spot where Parker's projected to have around 5 or 6 receptions. And so in most formats, I mean, he should be rostered, right? So if he's available in your league, I'd look to pick him up. And then finally, for those of you in deeper leagues, so only 14, 16 team leagues, Laquan Treadwell at 1% is an option, right? The Jaguars just seem to hate Laviska Shenault. He's just not going to work out this season. And whoever the third receiver is seems to be getting looks. And while we've all been burned by Treadwell numerous times in the past, he's always been a breakout candidate, but someone who's just never done anything. He actually looked pretty decent this last week. He has 8 and 5 targets the last 2 games, and their upcoming schedule is the Titans, the Texans, and the Jets, right? So if he's going to continue seeing 5 to 8 targets a week against those defenses, he's going to be someone you want in a 14 or 16 team league, and he's barely owned anywhere. Probably not going to need him in a 12-team league, but for those in deeper formats, I really think he's a decent add. But, again, going back through what we've done so far, has there been anyone who is a must-add? Anyone worth a number 1 claim? Anyone worth more than a few dollars in fab? No. Just want to reiterate that. At running back, the top 2 ads are players we went over last week, but we're going on bye, so they didn't make it as like the top claims. And that's Chuba Hubbard and Donta Foreman. Foreman would be my top option. He's 35% owned. He had, a really good game against the Patriots, but then they went on bye, right? And so a lot of people are going to forget that he's an option. I would imagine that McNichols is ready to return this week, which is going to impact Dontrell Hilliard much more than it impacts Foreman. Foreman is the early down back. That's not really changing. He's not going to have a large role in the receiving game, but Hilliard would. And so with McNichols coming back, obviously Foreman is the one that I prefer there. And they're facing the Jaguars this week. Jacksonville is absolutely terrible on both sides of the football. So Foreman should have a favorable matchup to go along with a favorable game script, and realistically should be the top ad at probably any position this week if he's available. How much you spend on him depends on your team. So I give a suggestion, but think about this in terms of what you need. If you need a win this week to get into the fantasy playoffs or secure a spot in the fantasy playoffs, and you've got $50 in fab left, half your fab left, what are you saving that for, right? You can't take that into the offseason with you and use it towards your team next season. That would be interesting. That's actually a cool wrinkle you could add in, but you can't, right? There's no leagues that actually do that. And so there's no sense in ending the season with $37 in fab. Just use it, right? If you think you need it, use it. And if Foreman's available against the Jaguars and you think you're going to start him this week, just use your fab on Foreman. Use your number 1 claim. You can't take the number 1 claim to the playoffs. We're going to go over some options that you can add, because the thought is basically, well, what if in the first or second week of the playoffs, there's some insane free agent ad that everyone needs, right? Well, we'll go over, the running backs who could end up being that, but there's not going to be a wide receiver that we haven't seen yet that is all of a sudden some insane ad, right? It is extremely unlikely that happens at the tight end position, extremely unlikely that happens at the quarterback position. And so you really would only be looking at some handcuff running back that happens to break out because the starter went down. And again, we'll go over who those players are. So you can add them now, and then hopefully you won't have to use anything in the future. So that's just a little take on the fab situation this week. Again, if there's someone you want, just get them, right? Because you can't take your fab into the off season. Next up, Chuba Hubbard, 56% owned, so still owned in a lot. But if you are in maybe a little bit of a smaller format, or maybe he went on bye last week and so people didn't choose to add him, he's still available in 44% of leagues. You should be going out and getting him. He's not going to be a feature back. They're still going to use other running backs in the receiving game. It's also the Panthers. They're not a good offense. But he's still the lead back on an NFL franchise to close the season, so he should be on 100% of leagues. I assume that he's going to be owned in 80% after this week, but there'll be a lot of leagues where he's out there, and so you should be picking him up. But again, Foreman's the top priority for me this week just because he is better than Hubbard. He's in a better situation. He's in a better matchup. I'd rather him. I want to talk about Kenneth Gainwell, 11% owned right now. he is an option for sure. Personally, I would not be going after him. I know a lot of people are going to ask. I figured I'd talk about it. He played well this last week and is involved in the receiving game. So when he gets this work, he's very valuable in fantasy. The problem is he played the Jets, who are just a fantastic, the best matchup you could possibly dream of for opposing fantasy running backs. And so any running back is going to destroy them. You can't really look at that. Also, they go on bye this week. And so while it's possible that post-bye, Sanders was an ankle injury. He got injured this week. He left the game. It's possible he's still hurt, and it's possible Jordan Howard's still hurt. But it's also possible that both of them return post-bye and that Gainwell's like a scratch, right? And so I don't think the upside's really worth wasting a roster spot on Gainwell right now because you're not going to use him this week. And there's a very strong chance you're not going to use him in the first week of the fantasy playoffs as well. And so I just don't see that being worth it. Like roster spots are pretty valuable right now because if you're not using one, you can just go out and get, premier handcuff and you're just adding upside to your roster for the playoffs. You could add streaming defense we're going to talk about. Like there are options you can do in the bench where I don't think Gainwell is worth it. So has a good game, has some upside in that first week of the playoffs if everything breaks his way. But for me, I wouldn't be going out and getting him. So let's talk about some of these handcuffs. Who are some guys you can add right now that could be available in your league who are not going to be valuable this next week, but could be, right? Everyone I'm going to talk about here is available in at least 50% of leagues and through some sort of situation could be very valuable. Sony Michel, Nyheim Hines, Devonta Booker, Samaje Perine, and Khalil Herbert. Again, none of these players are guys that you're starting in week 14. But you never know what could happen. Someone could get COVID. Someone could have a non-COVID illness. Someone could sprain an ankle in practice. They could get hurt during week 14 and be the top waiver ad, or their backup would be the top waiver ad in week 15. So there is definitely a chance that one of the players I just mentioned becomes extremely valuable during the fantasy playoffs. And so you should be using those extra spots on your bench for these players. Just like we've seen happen with A.J. Dillon, Madison, Jamal Williams, Ingram, Darrell Williams, Henderson to start the year, Sony Michel last week, Khalil Herbert. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Darnus Johnson was another one. Like, there are handcuffs. We don't know all the time who they're going to be, but there are handcuffs that, we knew when the starter went down, they're going to be very, very valuable. And so starting to use all of your bench spots on these players, that is going to work out for you in the long run. Again, the list that we're looking at this week, Sony Michel, if Henderson were to stay injured, I don't think that'll be the case, but it could be. Nyheim Hines, if Jonathan Taylor got hurt, would be very valuable. Booker, obviously be super valuable if Barkley went down. Perine would be like a low-end one if Mixon went down. And Khalil Herbert, we've already seen him be a running back one if Montgomery were to miss any time. So those guys that I would be stashing on the bench as your last spot in, just for that upside. You should also be stashing some defenses, right? You can have a defense that you like, but we're always streaming defenses for matchups. And so looking ahead into the fantasy playoffs, who are some defenses that I would absolutely be using some roster spots on? The first is the 49ers. They have the number 1 ranked playoff schedule for fantasy defenses they're going against. They play at home against the Falcons in week 15, at the Titans in week 16, and then at home against the Texans in week 17. I believe that if they're on free agency, that is your top stash. They're only available in 35% of leagues, so it may not be an option for everyone, but I wanted to mention it because they do have the number 1 schedule. I made that new page, remember? I shouted it out last week. There's a page on the site that shows every team and their strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs, and then you can sort by week, right? So if you have an option for week 15 and you're like, well, I want something for week 16 and 17, just sort by the week 16 and 17 columns. Everything's color coded, very, very easy to use. And again, just like with the last 3 years, the website's going to be free for the fantasy playoffs. So not this week, this is the last week of the fantasy playoffs, still have to have a membership now, but once we hit week 15, everything's going to be free on the site. So just wanted to make sure everyone knows that. If you make it to the playoffs, we're going to try and get you that championship. You'll be able to use the site, but it's not going to help you right now. If you should be looking right now for the defense streaming options because they might be taken by the time we get to playoffs. So they're number 1. Another really good stash is, of course, the Bills and the Dolphins. Unfortunately, the Bills are owned everywhere, right? If you don't have them, you're not getting them. Maybe there's a chance that the Dolphins are out there, but let's be honest, we've been talking about the Dolphins for the past 2 weeks as like fantastic streaming options. And so if you didn't get them before, someone else probably did. They do go on bye this week, though, so maybe you were thinking of dropping them, or maybe someone else is going to drop them. I would hold on to them. I added them last week. I plan on holding on to them because, again, they get a home matchup with the Jets in week 15. That is worth it, right? It is worth holding a roster spot on your bench, just not having someone this week. Pick up another defensive stream this week because that is a fantastic matchup for the first week of fantasy playoffs. The top defense stash that is likely available for everyone is the Chargers. They have definitely underperformed the season overall, but to close the season, they play at home against the Giants, then versus the Chiefs, which is tough, but then at Texans, and then versus the Broncos. That grades out as the third best playoff schedule, even factoring in the matchup against Kansas City. They're going to face the Broncos also when they're eliminated from the playoffs, and so that could be a positive for the Chargers defense. Two more I'll mention are Dallas and the Philadelphia Eagles. There's a chance that one of them is also available. They both play the football team twice and the Giants once, over their next 3 games. You hate to pick on the football team because I have like a soft spot in my heart for the football team. I think they have a lot of talented players and just haven't really been able to put it together, largely because of quarterback play. But quarterback play is also why we're targeting them. I talked about Heineke as a streaming option this next week. He's always a streaming option because he'll be fine in fantasy, but he's got the 5th most interceptions on the season despite ranking 14th pass attempts. He's going to take a few sacks in games, and he's definitely prone to making some turnovers that he's trying to win, right? I like Heineke as a player, but he makes mistakes, right? And he could absolutely throw a pick 6, absolutely get strip sacked for a fumble recovery. And so the football team is still a good defense to be targeting in fantasy. And so Dallas and the Eagles, again, those are 2 teams who have pretty decent playoff schedules. Obviously, you want Buffalo, you want Dallas, you want Miami, but again, the Eagles and the Chargers and the 49ers are all good options that are owned in far fewer leagues than those guys. And so if the best options are taken, those are ones I'd go after that if they're available. So that'll do it for the week 14 waiver wire video. You can see all my fab recommendations and streaming picks on the website, which again is going to be free for everyone starting the fantasy playoffs, not this week, but starting next week. And that includes all like the sports betting information. So your sports betting picks, DraftKings projections, DraftKings picks, all of that's going to be free. So if you are eliminated, you can check that stuff out as well. But that, my friends, is into this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.